The next paper is Small Bank Financing and Funding Hesitancy in a Crisis, Evidence from the Paycheck Protection Program, and Tetyana Balyuk is going to present.
I'm very excited to present this paper, and this is joint work with Nakpurnanand Prabhala, who is in the audience today, and Manju Puri. In this project, we're thinking about the delivery of government aid to small businesses in the times of crises. During large, unexpected economic shocks, the government may want to deliver financial aid to a large number of recipients by using financial intermediaries as middlemen to deliver the funds quickly. COVID-19 is an example of such shock, which resulted in a sudden and deep economic contraction with 15% unemployment and 30% GDP contraction in just a quarter. Small businesses, which are at the core of the US economy, were especially harmed by COVID. The US government's response was the $669 billion Paycheck Protection Program, a part of the $2 trillion CARES Act. The aid is provided to small businesses through banks as intermediaries, so we have two players in our setting: bank intermediaries who deliver the funds and small businesses who decide on whether to take the funds or not. So the questions we're asking is whether these players impact PPP delivery and how. Banks seem like a great solution to deliver government funds quickly to small businesses because they have extensive bank branch networks and most small businesses have bank accounts. However, private banks' own incentives may matter for how the government funds are allocated. Do banks indeed shape PPP credit supply? If so, how and why? Is there any variation between how small and big banks prioritize businesses? And is there a role for bank relationships? These are the questions we ask. Small businesses targeted by the PPP turned out especially vulnerable to the economic fallout of COVID. These businesses are highly constrained even in normal times, and even more so during economic crises. PPP provides forgivable loans to these businesses, which are very inexpensive and readily available. PPP should be welcomed by small businesses. Are they really? Do we detect any aversion to PPP funding, and why? The PPP is a really nice setting to understand the priorities and concerns of these two types of actors, because PPP is a large sudden shock for banks in the early PPP days. Banks had to prioritize clients for early access because banks got overwhelmed with PPP applications, and there was an aggregate shortage of funding. It is also a positive shock to financing supplied by small businesses, and therefore one could expect smallest and most vulnerable businesses to rush for funding first. So let us actually look at what we find in our project. We find that banks' priorities matter in the PPP delivery. Large clients get early PPP access, but this effect is attenuated when small banks deliver the funds. We also find that prior bank relationships help small businesses obtain early PPP access. These results speak to the special role of small banks and benefits of small firm, small bank pairing. The traditional explanations of such pairing rest upon soft information arguments. Small business lending involves collection and processing of soft information, which is difficult to transmit up hierarchies of big banks. There is little role for soft information in the PPP because PPP loans are government guaranteed. The firm's eligibility does not depend on their creditworthiness, and banks can also rely on certifications of applicants. We thus suggest in this project another rationale for small firm, small bank pairing outside traditional soft information arguments. Small business lending is the bread and butter of business for small banks. So these banks are less likely to prioritize large clients in crisis times because of future business opportunities with small firms and because of franchise value of small business lending for small banks. As when small firms bank with small banks, they are less likely to be placed in a backseat during crisis. For COVID, we have vaccines, but we do observe funding like vaccine hesitancy. Similarly, we find reluctance of small businesses to take PPP funds, which we call funding hesitancy in our paper. We find that despite taking PPP funds having positive announcement effects, more than 100 public firms return PPP funds quickly after using them. Surprisingly, the share prices of PPP returners increase upon announcement that they are returning government aid. We show that this funding hesitancy partly reflects wariness of audit and government investigations of the PPP recipients. In particular, we provide discontinuity evidence showing this effect. The results speak to the literature on penalties due to government investigations. Let me now talk briefly about the research design and the extensive data work that we've done in our project, and then I will proceed to showing you the results. The PPP program has several important features informing our research design. So here you can see the PPP timeline. The PPP started in early April 2020, and there was immediately a rush for funding. Bank capacity got strained and aggregate supply was in shortage, creating incentives for banks to prioritize certain types of clients. The first allocation of 349 billion was exhausted in only 15 days on April 16th. It was remedied later on April 27th when the program resumed. Thus, we defined early PPP access as receiving PPP funds before April 27th and late PPP access as receiving funds before the PPP Act in early June, which we treat as a structural break. This is also the time when uncertainty was the highest. I would also like to draw your attention to another important date on this timeline, the May 18th PPP return deadline. In late April, early May, government made a series of pronouncements related to future audits of PPP recipients, especially those who took PPP loans above 2 million, unless funds are returned by the deadline of May 18th. We exploit this feature in our empirical design. We use 3 data sets for our analysis, each with its own advantages. The first data set is the PPP loan release data from SBA, which contains the whole universe of public and private firms that obtain the PPP funds. This is the most comprehensive list, but the data do not contain firm characteristics. It cannot be used to estimate valuation effects or identify PPP returns. We thus hand collect data on public PPP recipients to overcome these issues. We put a lot of effort in collecting, cleaning the data, and matching the data to multiple data sets, which are outlined on the slide. For this sample, we have firm characteristics, share prices to compute treatment effects, and we can also identify PPP returners. We also bring in Universal Commercial Code data, or UCC, to measure prior bank relationships of the PPP recipients. Bank relationships for small businesses are notoriously difficult to find, and prior literature mostly focused on deal count data, which covers larger firms. In our empirical analysis, we focus on the match sample between UCC data and SBA PPP releases for tests based on the universe of all PPP recipients. So let me now jump to the results on prioritization of certain clients. We first summarize firm characteristics for early and late PPP recipients based on the public firm sample. From the demand side perspective, one could expect smaller and most vulnerable businesses to rush to get PPP funding early. But we find the opposite. Large firms go early, which suggests that intermediary supply effects may matter in the PPP delivery. We find this next by examining small banks and big banks participating in the PPP. These graphs compare the size distributions of early PPP recipients, which is solid line, and late PPP recipients, dashed line, for those 2 types of banks. A larger relative shift of the solid line to the right would indicate greater prioritization of large clients by a particular bank. These graphs suggest that big banks are more likely to push larger firms early, while small banks are more even-handed. The rigorous regression evidence we have in the paper confirms these results. We further look at subsample of firms with prior bank relationships. In this subsample, small firms seem to go early with small banks, but maybe not so much with big banks. In addition, when we look at the subsample without prior bank relationships, we find that small and big banks seem to behave similarly towards the PPP applicants. We find similar results in the entire universe of PPP recipients. Big banks appear to exhibit more pro-large firm behavior. In additional analysis, we also find that applying through a relationship bank increases the likelihood of getting early access, especially when there is a prior relationship with a big bank. Just to summarize this part quickly, we find that intermediary effects seem to matter in the PPP delivery, and we provide a non-soft information rationale for small firm, small bank pair. Let me now show you the results on the funding hesitancy that we have in our paper. We identify over 100 firms that return PPP funds promptly after receiving the funds. Now, why would firms that are financially constrained turn down extremely cheap and potentially forgivable funding in the middle of an economic crisis. This was a puzzle to us. One potential explanation is that taking PPP may be a negative signal of firm quality. This is not what we find. We find that taking PPP has positive announcement effects, but returning PPP also has positive announcement effects. So these graphs show abnormal stock returns around staggered announcements of PPP uptake by public firms. And as you can see, the effects seem to be positive. We confirm these results in regression analysis with pandemic period abnormal returns from fixed effects and clustering. And we do additional work in our paper to adjust for partial anticipation of PPP uptake. And also in the paper, we compute bank for the buck treatment effects of the program. This slide shows the announcement effects of returning PPP, and that these effects are also positive. Again, we confirm our results in regression analysis. To put this result in the context, there was little discussion of audits when firms applied, but the threat of government action became salient in late April and early May, when these firms selected to return the funds, mostly before the May 18th deadline. So what can explain the funding hesitancy? Of course, direct costs are really small, and this funding is inexpensive. So what we propose is indirect cost of government investigations as a source, as a reason for returning of the funds. And we provide discontinuity evidence in that respect. So here we see that larger and better firms tend to return PPP funds, and you can see this result more clearly on this graph, which plots the probability of PPP return against PPP loan size. You can see also here some discontinuity around the 2 million audit probability. Firms above this threshold are more likely to be audited. And we have confirming evidence, but let me skip this for the sake of time. We also have another evidence of discontinuity where we look at PPP applications in the broader sample. The left graph shows the density of PPP applications before the May 18th deadline, and the right graph shows the density after the deadline. You can clearly see a discontinuity in the application probability around the 2 million threshold. Lastly, we have some additional results in the paper in which we look at the similar program in the UK called Rates Relief Program. The program experienced PPP-like returns of funds by several large retailers after media reports that these retailers benefited from the pandemic. But there was no actual threat of or actual government investigations in this case. We find that rates relief return has experienced negative effects, whereas PPP return has experienced positive valuation effects, suggesting that it is scrutiny concerns in our sample that can explain the funding habit. Let me conclude in the 1 minute. We find that intermediary supply effects matter for the delivery of government aid. While banks seem to be a natural delivery channel, their priorities may matter when funding is scarce and in a crisis. There's also a style effect in the literature that small banks, small firm pairing can be explained by soft information. We uncover evidence for a different rationale that does not rely on soft information. We find that some small firms, although constrained return, are reluctant to take PPP funds. They seem to be wary of the powers of government to investigate PPP recipients. And this evidence suggests that there should be objectivity and tightness not only in ex-ante eligibility criteria, but also in ex-post audit standards. The paper is on SSRN. Please take a look. Thank you so much.